My name is Jack, and I have been a professional traveler for 12 years. A few months ago, a friend of mine mentioned an allegedly abandoned village deep within the forest near our town. He estimated it would take about a week to reach the village. He believed that if the stories were true, it would be the perfect destination for me to explore and investigate the mysterious disappearance of the villagers. I was immediately intrigued and agreed to embark on this journey. The prospect of uncovering the truth about this village was thrilling. If the village did exist, I could potentially go down in history for discovering it and revealing its secrets. This could even cement my reputation as the best traveler there is. I was dreaming of fame, and after a week of traveling and camping out in the forest, I was more than shocked and thrilled to realize that this village did indeed exist. I found myself standing on the outskirts, staring into this empty, eerie village. The village was silent, with vines and foliage overgrowing the place, covering every crumbling building and home. Windows were shattered and doors hung off their hinges, creaking in the soft wind. The streets were devoid of any signs of life, and the air was thick, as if the village itself was holding its breath. The sky above had turned gray, casting dark shadows all around me and creating a somber, haunting scene. As I wandered through the empty streets, I noticed remnants of what once was. A child's toy abandoned in the middle of the road, a cart tipped over with its contents spilled and rotting, and a well that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The village seemed frozen in time, a ghostly reminder of a life that once thrived here. Suddenly, I heard a faint scurrying sound, like something was searching for something else. My heart began to race as I followed the noise, leading me to the center of the village. The sound grew louder, more frantic, echoing off the walls of the empty buildings. My curiosity was tinged with fear as I approached the source of the noise. There, in the shadows, I saw it, a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It had an alien, demonic appearance, with skin that seemed to shift colors in the dim light, blending seamlessly with its surroundings. Its eyes glowed a menacing red, and its elongated limbs ended in sharp claw-like fingers. It moved with a disturbing grace, its head constantly twitching as it searched for something, me. I quickly ducked behind a dilapidated wall, trying to steady my breathing. The creature's movements became more frantic, and its guttural growls filled the air. I could hear it getting closer, its claws scraping against the ground. I peeked out from my hiding spot and saw the creature's eyes scanning the area, narrowing as it sensed my presence. The fear was unbearable. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to remain as still as possible. The creature was now just a few feet away, its breath hot and foul, reeking of decay. I could see its shadow growing larger on the ground, inching closer and closer as it crept up behind me. The air around me felt thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. Just as it seemed the creature would find me, a sudden noise from a tree limb falling in the opposite direction distracted it. The sharp crack of the branch echoed through the still air, causing the creature to whip its head around and dart towards the sound. Its swift predatory movements were both terrifying and mesmerizing. This unexpected diversion gave me the precious seconds I needed to make my escape. I sprinted through the village, not daring to look back. My legs burned with exertion and my lungs felt like they were on fire. But I couldn't afford to slow down. The enraged howls of the creature echoed behind me, growing louder and more desperate. With every ounce of strength, I pushed myself forward, dodging obstacles and leaping over debris. The streets now felt like a treacherous maze, each turn and corner a potential trap. But I had no choice. I had to keep running, hoping against hope that I could outrun the nightmare that pursued me. The village seemed to stretch endlessly, each step feeling like it took me further into a nightmarish labyrinth. The creature was gaining on me now, its presence a constant, terrifying weight at my back. I could hear its claws pounding the ground behind me, each thud a reminder of how close it was. As I ran, I caught glimpses of more creatures lurking in the shadows, their eyes glowing with the same malevolent light. They watched me with predatory interest, their forms shifting and blending with the darkness. The village was teeming with them, and I realized with growing horror that I had stumbled into a nest of these nightmarish beings. Panic surged through me, threatening to overwhelm my senses, but I forced myself to stay focused. I knew that one wrong move, one moment of hesitation could be my last. The narrow, winding streets seemed to close in around me, each corner hiding new dangers. My only hope was to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of the terror that hunted me. As more creatures lunged out and began to chase me, I could hear my heart thumping in my chest, feeling as though it was about to explode. Finally, I reached the edge of the village and plunged into the forest, the creatures' cries fading into the distance. The dense trees provided a temporary refuge, and I didn't stop running until I was sure I was far enough away. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Out of breath and trembling, I made it back to civilization. I warned everyone I knew and met to stay away from the abandoned village, telling them of the horrifying creatures I had encountered. The village was abandoned for a reason, and I knew I was lucky to have barely made it out alive. The tale of my harrowing escape spread quickly, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked in the forgotten corners of the world. Instead of fame, I got trauma. John rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the clock on his computer's desktop. Just past 11. Leaning back in his chair, he stifled a yawn and thought back to earlier that day, back to when his boss told him to stay late to finish an important report. John straightened up and fought to keep his eyelids from drooping, slapping his face gently. Stay awake. Stay awake. It's almost finished. I just need to stay awake a bit longer. Looking away from the glaring white spreadsheet in front of him, he dragged his weary gaze across his desk and noticed the red-striped peppermint next to his keyboard. He picked up the cellophane-wrapped candy and eyed it, thinking back to when he had gotten earlier that day. He had arrived in the office break room desperate for some coffee when he had noticed the unusual gift basket sitting on one of the tables inside. Approaching it, he picked up a gold-embossed card on it that simply said, "Help yourself." Looking around, he had intended to ask a coworker about the unusual gift basket. Seeing no one, he shrugged and took a single piece of peppermint candy for himself before grabbing his coffee and walking back to his desk. That had been a few hours ago, and he had forgotten entirely about the sweet treat until now. Maybe this can help. Taking the peppermint out of the wrapper, he popped it into his mouth and leaned forward, returning to work. Soon his mouth was filled with the sweet and aromatic flavor of the treat as he swirled it around with his tongue. Completing the report, he saved it and sent it to his boss before looking at the clock again. It was now 11:30. Satisfied, John leaned back in his chair and stretched before the realization hit him. The peppermint was still in his mouth, completely solid and undissolved. Curious, John tentatively swirled it around in his mouth before placing it between his teeth and biting down hard. Pain flared in his molars as the peppermint failed to give way, feeling like a hard rock in his mouth. John reached for a nearby decorative ashtray he never used and moved to spit it out, but realized with horror that his mouth would not open, no matter how hard he tried. His lips were sealed completely shut. Shocked, and with panic slowly starting to set in, he tried peeling his lips apart with his fingers to no avail. Grabbing a tissue from a nearby dispenser, he tried rubbing it against his lips, and failed again to part them. It was then that he heard it. A crack. It was loud enough to warrant his full attention, temporarily distracting him from his sealed lips. At first, he thought that he had irreparably damaged one or more of his teeth from his bite, but then the cracking continued. A small cracking sound he heard from within his mouth. For a moment, John simply sat there, listening. Curious, he swirled his tongue around the peppermint in his mouth, feeling cracks in the surface of it and some small chunks missing. But that doesn't make sense. It shouldn't be cracking after being bitten. It should have cracked while... It was then he felt it. Or rather, them. Small little protrusions from within the peppermint, feeling like sharp little twigs or... He slowly moved his tongue across one of the protrusions. It twitched. John gagged, disgust and fear washing over him. He ran to the office restroom and tried his best to pry his mouth open, but it still wouldn't give. By now, the protrusions were writhing, and he could feel pieces of the candy sitting in various pockets within his mouth, its mostly shattered form still lying on his tongue. John turned the restroom faucet on full blast, leaning into the sink and letting the water rush over his lips, then getting some soap from the wall dispenser and rubbing it vigorously against them. They still would not part. John froze, his lips still under the running water as he felt movement in his mouth. Pieces of the candy now scattered around his mouth, and a prickly, multi-legged form stood dead in the center of it. Its clawed legs splayed out against the walls and ceiling of his mouth as it balanced there, like a half-opened umbrella in a tube. Time seemed to stand still as fear gripped John's heart, dread building in his stomach. Ragged breath after ragged breath entered through his flaring nostrils as his breathing intensified. At first, the creature seemed to simply remain there, as if waiting for something. And as John sucked in a breath, he felt it turn and move towards his throat. John gagged involuntarily as he struggled to expel the foreign invader through his sealed lips. Desperately, he pushed against it with his tongue, trying to crush the creature. However, as if it had expected this, he felt it push back with surprising strength as it slowly crawled closer and closer to the back of his throat, inching its way along while pressing back against his tongue. John was in a full-on panic now, trying to push his fingers in between his lips to peel them apart. Yet, as hard as he tried, they would not give. He clawed at his lips, red scratches appearing before him as he watched himself in the restroom mirror. It was then a thought struck him and he pushed his hand into his pocket, fishing around before pulling out something he had always carried around with him, but never once thought he would ever resort to using in such a way. His hand trembled as he opened his clenched fist. His trusty pocket knife lay folded in his palm, gleaming in the fluorescent light of the office restroom. Hesitantly, he flicked it open. Its sharp blade shone with a mirror polish in the light of the restroom, daring him to use it. I can't. The creature was now at the back of his throat, causing John to cough and gag violently. His body was doing its best to fight and expel the creature, but his mouth remained shut. He eyed the blade one last time before turning it on his lips. John looked over the data on the screen of his computer, sighing with satisfaction before saving it and sending it to his boss. Wearily, he looked at the clock in the corner of his screen. Just before 5. Standing up and stretching, he shuddered a bit at the relief that flooded into his tired muscles. John made his way towards his kitchen, shuffling towards the fridge in his sandals as his stomach growled. Just as he was about to open the door, he heard his doorbell ring. Huh? I didn't order any packages recently. Is someone visiting? No one called. He made his way to his front door and slowly opened it. The front porch stood empty, not a soul in sight. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something on his doormat. John looked down. His blood ran cold as his heart skipped a beat. Frantically, he looked up, searching for any clue as to who could have left this here. But there was nothing. No delivery truck nearby, no one around that could have left it here. John slowly looked back down at the package that waited on his doormat. Idly, his tongue ran over the scars on his lips. His eye twitched as he reached an especially long and deep one that ran lengthwise across his once intact lips. The memory flooded back into his mind. The strong smell of the disinfectant used in the bathroom, the sticky sensation of blood as it poured from his ruined mouth, the taste of it as he nearly drowned in his own viscous red fluid. He remembered the pain from the jagged slash that finally allowed him access to his mouth. He remembered reaching inside and pulling out the creature, the invader, the way it squirmed as it fought the grip of his hand, all spiky legs and hard, prickly exoskeleton. He remembered throwing it on the restroom floor and stomping it until nothing remained but a dark green stain. He remembered collapsing against the sink afterward before treating his wound with paper towel and calling emergency services. The rest was a bit of a blur after that. He vaguely remembered being all but forced to resign, with no evidence of the creature being found in the restroom afterward. How recommendations for psychological evaluation were being pushed onto him. How he had found another job that allowed him to work from home. How he desperately wanted to simply move on and forget that any of that ever happened to him. But he couldn't forget. And now, as the ghostly taste of peppermint invaded his mouth, John felt utter repulsion and betrayal as his stomach growled once again at the sweet smell wafting from the gift basket before him. Large, brightly colored rainbow swirl lollipops, huge chocolate bars, and of course multiple cellophane-wrapped peppermints all lay in a nest of crinkled green plastic grass. Within the basket, neatly placed in front of all the confectionery treats, lay a lone gold-embossed card with a single word written on it: Enjoy. Do you believe in curses? I didn't consider myself a superstitious person. I didn't believe in the paranormal and generally considered the ramblings of superstition to be more like modern mythology. People just taking allegories of concepts and held beliefs and trying to give them solid meaning and agency by attaching some force to it that moves beyond the belief of what our own eyes can see. Recent events, though, have forced me to reconsider my beliefs on the paranormal. What I have come to learn and to fear is that not believing in superstition might not change how it can affect you. Despite not believing this sort of thing myself, I might have to start. See, I think I might be cursed. Silly thing for a skeptic to say, I know, but I will tell you the story of the last few days and maybe you can tell me if it sounds like I am or not. Maybe I am just being paranoid. The tragedy of recent events having drowned my skeptical mind in a wave of the paranormal beliefs of others, though I fear the nagging feeling that it could be real. If this is all real, then I think I am in trouble. 2 weeks ago, my girlfriend Heather and I were on the way to a somber event. It was the funeral service of her best friend Gwen, and she was trying her best to compose herself, but having a hard time. I don't know if I can do this, she said for the third time since we had departed, her sleeve wet with tears before we had even arrived. I tried my best to comfort her, but she was taking the loss of her friend hard. It will be okay, honey. I know it's hard all of this has been, but I know she would have wanted you to be there to remember her, along with all her other friends and family. I told her that, not really knowing if it was true, since I did not know much about her friend Gwen before she had passed so suddenly. I put a reassuring hand on her shoulder without diverting too much attention from driving through the light traffic in the small town the service was held at. I know, I just can't believe she is gone, she said while wiping her eyes a final time as we arrived at the funeral home. It was a gloomy day outside. Clouds shrouded any possible rays of sunshine. The sky threatened rain, yet was not quite ready to unleash the downpour. Very fitting day for a funeral, I thought to myself, and I opened Gwen's door and helped her out of the car. We stepped out and saw a large group of people in dark-colored clothes gathered near the entrance. Moving towards the group, Heather noticed Gwen's parents and suppressed another sob. I tried to reassure her again, and we moved to greet them and express our condolences. It was tough seeing the pained resolve on their faces, as many cried around them, but they did their best to stay composed and thank each person for coming. The service had not started yet, but apparently the viewing had. We were told to head inside and to pay our respects and view the body if we wished, or to just write a memorial note. Heather decided she was feeling strong enough to go to the viewing, and I held her hand as we entered. There were others there softly crying or solemnly looking on in quiet respect. 2 individuals caught my eye, though. I supposed Gwen's family was religious, but these 2 looked a bit extreme. They were wearing some sort of religious regalia and holding crucifixes. They seemed to hold them up and mutter some sort of prayer. Not too odd if they were priests or something, but it got strange when I heard something whispered quietly about how the Lord banishes all evil, and through his light we ask for an end to this bloody reaping, we pray for forgiveness. The robed figures finished the chant and made the sign of the cross one last time, and left the body in the viewing room, looking back at us as they left in an oddly paranoid way, like they did not trust something about us being in the room. I brushed it off, and Heather did not seem to notice or care about the strange priests or whatever they were, or the weird sermon about evil they seemed to have had with her friend's body. We approached the coffin slowly, and Heather began crying again. I looked down into the finely carved casket and saw her. The embalming process always alters the look of people no matter how skilled they are. It's just not quite them anymore. I felt terrible for Heather, and how she lost her friend, and I felt even worse for Gwen, of course. To have a heart attack at 34 was a genuine tragedy. She had had no underlying health issues of note and lived a fairly active and healthy lifestyle, so it was even more puzzling to everyone who had known her. I had been holding Heather's hand, but as we stepped closer, she broke away and reached down and touched the hand of her friend and said her last goodbyes. I looked on and felt moved by the touching scene, and felt a shade of the deep sadness that she had felt for her lost friend. In my sympathetic reverie, I received a sudden flash of deep and profound sadness, which I thought made sense. What I was not prepared for was what felt like a strange buzzing tension in the air, and a feeling of unbridled anger like when a furious person is staring someone else down. I looked over my shoulders and across the room, but no one else was in there with us at that moment. Then I felt a strange pain in the back of my ears, almost like they were suddenly ready to pop. It felt very strange, but I had no idea what was happening. I was just standing there, unmoving, looking at Heather hold her friend's hand and say her goodbyes. Then I noticed her hand and saw something disturbing. As Heather held Gwen's right hand, I noticed what may have been an oversight by the makeup and mortuary workers who are supposed to prepare the bodies for viewing. There were fairly pronounced scratches in irregular patterns on the top portions of her fingers. They were initially hard to see, but were definitely there, down about halfway on each digit. I had a strange fancy that they brightened and thrummed in time with the disturbing feeling in the air, and I did not like the weird synchrony. I moved closer to try and put a hand on Heather's shoulder, but suddenly the bubble popped and the pressure in my head exploded as it felt like both my eardrums popped and the blinding headache almost made me cry out. Before I could, though, I heard Heather cry out first, not in grief, but in pain. She was startled out of her own grieving by the pain of something, and she clutched her own right hand and looked down at a small but deep cut on her right index finger. It was bleeding a good bit for how small it seemed, and I quickly grabbed some tissues nearby and helped her cover it. What happened? Was there something sharp left in her casket? I asked her while still holding her hand and trying to steady her. I don't know, there was nothing there, I was just holding her hand. Her poor hand, whoever did her makeup and preparation should be ashamed. She hated that color, and whatever it was in there cut her hand as well. Heather responded, looking on the verge of crying again and trying to distract her grief with temporary anger over the thought of her best friend's preparation not being perfect. We both saw another group waiting to enter and realized our time was up, so we exited the viewing room. I was able to get a Band-Aid from the car's first aid kit for Heather's cut. By that time, it had stopped bleeding, even though it looked disturbingly deep. I bandaged it anyway and disinfected it just to be safe, and Heather let out another whimper of pain. I apologized profusely, and we composed ourselves and went to the main hall for the ceremony. The main service was set to start in about 20 minutes, but we never sat for the service. We had to leave about 10 minutes later. We were settled in, and I thought we would be okay, but I heard Heather quietly mumble, "Not now, not now." I asked her if she was all right, and she groaned in pain again and held a hand to her forehead. "No, not right now, I can't do it, I need to go. We need to go." She stood up, grabbed my arm, and we left. Not too many people noticed us leaving since we were close to the back, but I shot an apologetic look at those who did. Rushing through the hall, I noticed the robbed figures again, and they seemed to regard Heather and I with a new apprehension, and they cleared out of our way and crossed themselves as we moved quickly down the hall and past them. We moved quickly since Heather was pulling me along, but as we departed, I thought I heard one of them say something in Latin or something. It sounded like maledictionum. We rounded the corner and I realized where she had been rushing. She had made it to the restroom and promptly went in, and I heard vomiting followed by sobbing and then the sink running and the door opening again. It's a migraine, right now of all times. It is so bad I can barely see straight, and I puked at Gwen's funeral. "I can't believe this. We can't stay. We have to go. I can't do this now." I said my goodbye to her. "We have to go." "I am so sorry, Gwen," Heather said while she continued to cry and clutch her head. I held her arm and we quickly moved back out to the car and headed home. On the way home, the sky finally decided to open up and a torrential rain began. Despite the pounding of the rain on the car, I could not hear much over Heather's anguished moaning. I did not know what was worse for her at that moment, the migraine or the sadness over her friend. Yet despite the professed agony of the migraine, she seemed to be holding her hand like it was still wounded, and in particular, the finger that had been cut in Gwen's casket. I thought it was strange, but she seemed to writhe in pain like that small cut hurt worse than her migraine. I was so distracted by the scene I almost rear-ended a car in front of me, and I had to slam on the brakes. I apologized to Heather and asked if she was okay, but just held her hand on her face and did not seem to notice the jarring stop we had come to. Something was off. She was normally terrified of traffic and driving in the rain, but barely noticed when we almost got into a crash. We arrived home and Heather went straight to bed and fell into a fitful sleep. Outside, the rain had become a full thunderstorm and was raging, strong winds picking up as well. I was afraid the power might go out, so I started looking for some candles or flashlights. The twilight hour mixed with the pressing storm gave the outside look a disturbing, hellish red quality that seemed an eerie nightcap to the day's disturbing and sad events. Heather had stayed asleep, and I was about to join her when I heard screaming from upstairs, and I rushed up to check on her. Heather was bolt upright, panting and heaving and clutching her hand. She started whimpering and saying, "I'm sorry, Gwen, I'm sorry, I didn't know, not us, please, not us." Over and over. I sat down and reached across the bed to try and comfort her. But when I touched her shoulder, she whirled around and struck my hand, and for a moment she had a distorted and deranged appearance on her face. The next second she recovered and looked confused and horrified that she had just struck me, and proceeded to apologize repeatedly to me and then back to Gwen again. I had no idea what was going on, but I was getting worried about her mental health. As she finally settled back down, she rolled over and fell back asleep, and I tried to settle in and ignore that nagging feeling that something was very wrong. I know everyone grieves differently, but the way she had been acting was worrying. I hoped that tomorrow would be better. I was about to drift off when I heard a disturbing sound that made my stomach turn. It sounded sort of like fingernails cutting into skin. It was faint at first, but eventually I realized it was coming from Heather, and I sat up and hopped out of bed and slowly moved around to her side to get a look at her prone form rolled over, facing the opposite way. To my horror, she still seemed asleep, but was unconsciously scratching deep cuts into her right middle finger with the nails on her left. The old cut had been opened as well, and her hand was bleeding profusely again. "Oh my God, Heather, wake up!" I shouted and shook her shoulders, and she woke with a scream. Before she knew what was happening, I had a towel in hand and was covering her bleeding fingers. "What happened? I thought I was asleep?" She mumbled out in a dazed, a dreamy-sounding voice, seemingly oblivious to any pain caused by the self-mutilation. I had no idea how she had not known she was doing that, or how she couldn't feel it. She was showing a disturbing degree of dissociation since she had come back from the funeral, and I was worried she might be having a mental breakdown. I brought some first aid supplies and went to clean her wounds. When I went to disinfect and bandage her fingers, I saw an odd and seemingly deliberate pattern that had been carved onto the fingertips. I don't know how, but it looked disturbingly familiar. I took a picture of the morbid design and tried showing it to her. When I showed her the work she had done to her own finger, she merely said, "Oh, that's what that was." Then, as if uninterested by the conversation, she fell asleep again. Nothing about this was right. I needed to see what was happening with Heather. The next day was worse, and Heather woke up with a very high fever. I tried to give her medicine for it, and she seemed weirdly mistrustful and would slap the Tylenol out of my hands and stare at me as if I had just tried to kill her. "I know what you're trying to do, I know," she muttered, though not looking at me when she spoke. Despite the accusation and look, she seemed to be talking to herself or someone else and not me. I decided to call her parents and see if they could talk to her and help. It was strange, though, since the line seemed to be dead when I called on both of our phones. I called her sister as well, and no answer. It was getting weirder and weirder. The storm had hardly abated outside, and I was concerned about leaving Heather in this state and venturing out into the tempest to get her help. She lay on the couch, feverish and rambling and staring weirdly at her hands for minutes at a time. I tried to let her rest, but as the storm picked up outside, I saw her visibly sweating, and I took her temperature, and it was 105 degrees. I had to get her fever down, so I tried to wake her to take some medicine and run a cool shower for her. Heather's eyes blinked open, and a hazy look had glossed over her entire face as she sat up and struck me in the head, knocking down the offered medicine again. "Not again! Not again! No more! Not upon us!" She started ranting and screaming at me. I tried to calm her down, but she hurled a nearby chair at me, and I had to flee the living room and run upstairs while trying to talk to her and de-escalate. Despite my attempts at reaching her, she did not seem to be listening to me or anyone in the room, just some other perceived being. She seemed to be alternating between directing her fury at something, then apologizing to it. "Why did you leave? Why did you do this to me? It's not fair. Why her? Why me?" She screamed ever louder until falling silent and collapsing on the floor. I needed help. Something was very wrong. I did not know if this was a psychotic break or if the fever had addled her into a violent frenzy, but she needed help now, so I dialed 911 and called an ambulance. Mercifully, I got through and was able to call for help. After hanging up the phone, I looked back where I expected the prone form of Heather, only to find her bolt upright and carving her right hand with a kitchen knife. It was those creepy lines. She had slashed them on her remaining fingers and was holding up her hand in a bloody spectacle as if checking her work. She looked at me with a deranged smile that shifted to an agonized look of pure despair and said, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Her, me, you, all of it. It is all going to end. No stopping it now." The air in the room became heavy, and the pressure in my head reminded me of how I felt when we were viewing Gwen at the service. My head ached, my teeth hurt, and I sat there paralyzed with dread watching Heather hyperventilate and look at her ruined hand until suddenly the air swept out of the room and my eardrums burst and Heather fell to the floor. Her eyes were open and she was not breathing. I held her hand and tried to perform CPR on her, yet to no avail. She was dead before emergency services arrived. I sat in disbelief next to her lifeless form, holding her hand and crying. I was in utter shock. How could she have died? When the EMTs arrived, they tried to resuscitate but were unsuccessful. It was declared as a cardiac failure. That was all they could surmise as for what could have killed her. A heart attack, just like Gwen. When they moved her away and placed her on the gurney, I felt a sharp pain on my hand and I realized that her nails must have scratched my finger or something as I looked down at my right index finger and saw a bloody line formed near the top, down past the nail in a disturbing pattern that caught my eye. I was barely able to give my statement over the blinding headache I had developed. Despite the shock, grief, and general horror of the events that unfolded before me, I was suddenly very tired. When the emergency services had left, I felt so overwhelmed by the tragedy of what I had experienced that I collapsed into a heap on the couch and passed out. I had horrible dreams while I slept, of Gwen and Heather out under the red stormy sky calling to me. I felt the terrible pressure in the air and that feeling of unbridled anger. I saw flashes of the strange priests and the word they whispered, maledictionum. That was last night. When I awoke from the horrible dreams, I came to a disturbing realization. This cut, it is like the cut that Heather had. She held Gwen's hand, and in a few days, she was dead as well. I don't know what the hell is happening, but I am even more disturbed by the word that those priests spoke, maledictionum. It turns out it was Latin after all, and what it roughly translates to is the curse. I can scarcely believe it. Does this mean they thought this is some sort of death curse? No, that's impossible. I'm just letting the grief and trauma of the last few days color my reality with nonsense. Yet as I write this, my head is getting foggy again, and I fear what will happen to me next. Grief can make us experience terrible things. It can drive us mad, and it can reap a physical toll. I know it's grief over losing her in such a terrible way. I can't believe she is gone. I can't physically cope, that's all. I am destroyed emotionally, but I will be okay. Curses can't be real. No, the grief is real. I will manage. Everything will be okay somehow. Sorry, I will need to update everyone another time. I need to clean myself up. I managed to get a terrible paper cut on my middle finger and it is bleeding a lot. It's funny, I never thought a paper cut could look so strange. It almost matches the other scratch and it looks oddly familiar. A scream in the dark. You jolt yourself upright, breath coming in ragged sheets clinging to the sweat on your skin. Hey, it's okay, it's okay. A hushed and soothing voice. A hand rubs your back. I'm here, it's all right. Your breaths get easier and you take in the motel room around you. It's a hot night and the stifling darkness is permeated only by the sickly light from the muted TV, where a cheerful woman soundlessly expounds on the virtues of a new vacuum. A squeaking ceiling fan fights fitfully against the heat. The vertical window blinds click together faintly. From far off, the distant rumble of cars on the highway. Are you okay? Another nightmare? Yeah. You make out. Do you want to talk about it? You lie together on the bed, half-formed in the television's feverish glow. The hand continues to rub your back. You are silent for a long time and then you begin to speak. There was something waiting for me outside the house. I was in my old childhood home again, but I was still grown up, and all the walls were all windows floor to ceiling, and there was something standing just outside, always outside, wherever I was in the house. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. It was very tall and hairless, and it wore no clothes, and its pale white skin was wet with viscera, like a newborn's. Its eyes were all blue. All iris, no pupils. I would stumble around the house with my eyes closed, but I could feel its gaze on me all the time. Its eyes were wet too, like it was crying, but it wasn't crying. It was smiling. Its teeth were big and gleaming, and its mouth took up half its face. I knew it was waiting for me, that it couldn't come in the house, but I'd have to leave the house sometime, and when I did, it would be there, and it would gather me into its embrace and the things it would do. Then I knew, because it would whisper them to me at night from just beyond the glass. My family could come and go as they'd please, and the thing would note their passing with a grin, and then go back to gazing at me. No one believed me that the thing was there, and for my own good, my parents tried to get me to step out the door. But when they opened the door, it was standing there on the doorstep, arms outstretched for me, grin wider than ever, and I fought and kicked and screamed until they let me go. It started to leave love tokens for me. Dead animals under my window, neighborhood cats and dogs, a raccoon, a couple coyotes, all hanging from the trees on the lawn, big claw marks etched into their sides, festering with flies, entreating eyes looking up into my window. That's how my family would find me. The last token it would leave would be me, dangling in the yard there among the rotting animals. So it told me. Its voice was very soft, almost gentle. I knew somehow that all it needed to step beyond the threshold and enter the house and do what it wanted to, me, was to hear a word, but I didn't know what this word was. It could have been anything. My family would whisper to each other about my plight, and I'd scream at them to shut up, because at any moment they might accidentally say the word and let it in. Any day they could say it, one day they would say it. And I couldn't sleep and I couldn't think. This isn't real. This isn't real, I told myself. And then it hit me. It wasn't. It was a dream. This was my mind, and I could make it all go away. I opened my eyes, and I looked out at the thing, and I told it to go away. But its smile grew widest of all, and it shot me a little wink, and I knew then that it knew I was dreaming too, and it didn't want to follow me into the house. It wanted me to follow me out of the dream. And then you woke up, and then I woke up. What do you think the word was? I don't know. It doesn't matter anyway, says the soft voice from the darkness beside you. I'm here now, and I'm never leaving you. Static on the TV now. Is the hand that clutches you ever tighter, wet and slick? Maybe, but it is a hot evening, the hottest of the year. That's all. Does the skin entwined with yours seem to gleam palely in the dark? It is only the light of the television. Do you smell a touch of rot and hear a buzzing of flies? It's a crappy motel after all. Maybe if you close your eyes, nothing bad can happen. Maybe if you hold your breath, the next moment never needs to come. I live in a small town named Mayward, where summer evenings are filled with the sounds of crickets and cicadas, and the sky turns a beautiful shade of gold. I like to think I live an ordinary life. I married my husband 2 years ago, and we've been happily married ever since. We've thought about having kids, but haven't had any yet. We want to wait a few more years. Michael, my husband, works evening shifts at the chicken plant and usually gets home around 10 p.m. One night I was getting ready for bed when my phone rang. It was Michael. I answered and he said, "Hey babe, I'm not going to be coming home tonight. I just wanted to let you know I love you." "What do you mean you're not coming home?" I asked him, but the line went dead. I was worried, but my husband is a very strong and clever man, so I was sure he had to work a double shift and just had poor service in the factory. I took some sleeping pills to help me sleep that night, since I wasn't used to sleeping without him. The next morning when I woke up, my husband still wasn't there. I called his phone, but there was no answer. I decided to wait a few hours before calling again or contacting the police. I was sure he was fine. However, when there was a knock at my door and a policeman stood behind it, my heart sank. "Mrs. Wilmington?" the policeman asked. "Yes?" I replied with wide eyes, afraid of what he was about to say. Mrs. Wilmington, I'm Officer Dawson, and I'm sorry to inform you, ma'am, but your husband was in a terrible head-on collision after running a stop sign last night. He was pronounced dead at the scene. I broke down into tears. Through my broken heart and clouded mind, my thoughts flickered to something. His phone call. May I ask when this happened? I inquired. It was around 9:42 p.m., he responded. I pulled out my phone and checked the call log. I had received his call at 9:55 p.m. I broke down into tears again as Officer Dawson held me. It will be all right, he said. I had my husband's funeral 2 months ago, and I still don't know how to cope with his absence. The pain of losing him feels as fresh as it did that day. Adding to my confusion and grief is the fact that I received a call from him after the accident, and I still don't know how to explain it. My girlfriend and I have been dating for a few months now, and we've started to have some form of routine together. Among other things, one of these habits is to lay down on the bed with a cover on to watch some TV. Because of that, there's always a blanket on the bed, most of the time rolled into a ball on the top part of the bed. My girlfriend sometimes loves to goof around and hide under the blanket to surprise me when I come into the room. It's obviously not a surprise, as you can quite easily see her sitting or laying down under the blanket. It makes her giggle when I find her. It's quite cute how she acts, and I am now ready to deal with our future children. Last night, as I went to the bathroom to do my usual night routine, I came back to the room to see that usual human blanket shape on the bed, which means she's more than likely sitting under there waiting for me. That's where I noticed one small detail that felt off to me. The bedroom door is open. She usually doesn't leave that door open when she's in there. Our bedroom has one door leading to the bathroom where I came from, and on the other side there's that door that leads to the hallway. As I'm walking quietly to close the main bedroom door, I hear some giggles coming from under the blanket. I thought it was once again cute how she acted like that. As I'm getting really close to the door and turned around to surprise her, I heard something that made me let out a small scream. "Hey babe, are you done in the bathroom?" I heard yelled from the kitchen. My whole body stopped moving as if paralyzed with fear. At this point, I didn't know where to look. I felt the need to look at the blanket on the bed, moving like someone was hiding underneath, while simultaneously looking towards the kitchen. I could see the light coming from the kitchen and a shadow moving, as if someone was doing something there. Something was clearly off here, but I couldn't see or know which one was the problem. Suddenly, as I was looking at the general direction of the kitchen, I saw my girlfriend emerge from there looking at me. "Oh, hey babe, I guess you didn't hear me earlier, but..." She started saying to me, but stopped when she saw the horror on my face. "What's wrong?" she then asked. I couldn't let a word out of my mouth. If she was here, who or what was under the blanket? As she arrived at the door, I turned around to look at the blanket. As if I had dreamed everything, the blanket just unfolded on the bed without a sign of anything under it. I told my girlfriend about what I saw and heard, and she just thought I was making some sort of joke or poking fun at her. I felt like I was crazy, just imagining things. All of this felt too real to me, and I couldn't simply ignore it. I tried telling this story to a few people, but they just seemed to feel like I was simply tired and imagined things. All of this made me feel uneasy around the apartment, and since we talked about moving to a different part of town, this seemed like the time to do it. My nights were getting more and more restless after that. I kept thinking about this, feeling scared and uneasy in my own bedroom. I think what drives me truly crazy by now is the fact that I sometimes hear in the distance the same giggling noises I heard from underneath the blanket.